But we'll go ahead and get started. I'll introduce myself first. My name is Jocelyn King. I'm the CEO and founder of VirgilHR. Virgil offers a technology that provides instant prescriptive employment and labor law guidance to you on day-to-day work. Any type of leave request an employee has, or termination and final wages, or reasonable accommodations requests you're going through that you typically be going online and Googling for or talking to a lawyer about, our technology can help you with instantly instead. Amber, I'll pass it off to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Amber Trail. I am the Chief Engagement Officer with Elite HR Connections. We are a community filled with HR professionals of all walks of life, and whether you're just starting out in college, coming out into the workforce, or ready to retire and maybe starting your own consulting business, we offer a judgment-free and supportive environment for all HR professionals. And I've been in HR for a little over 15 years now, hard to believe. But I'm really excited to be here with all of you today. So thank you, Jocelyn, for having me on.
Thank you. Katie?
Hey, everybody. My name is Katie Wandtke, and I'm the VP of People at Pivot Energy, which is a solar developer based out of Denver, Colorado. And we also have another location just outside of Baltimore, Maryland. I've spent about the last 10 years working in HR, mainly for PE and VC-backed companies that have gone through substantial phases of growth. And so I'm very excited to be here and to share a little bit about what we've learned and I've learned during this whole journey.
Thank you. And Gia?
Hello, everyone. My name is Gia Wiggins. I am the CEO and founder of Auditocity. Auditocity is a human resources compliance and best practices auditing platform. And so I'm super excited to talk to you today, as one of the topics we'll be discussing as audits. I've been in human resource since 1998, and the focus of Auditocity is to help companies to do a self-audit of their human resources programs, to look at both compliance as well as best practice and provide findings to help you to remediate your programs. So happy to be here with you today.
All right, thank you very much. I always start just by saying, I know people have to get off the call early sometimes. If you're interested in learning more about VirgilHR, please feel free to scan this QR code and you'd set up a time directly with me and I can go through a demo with you. We'll also have this QR code at the very end of the presentation as well. And a quick disclaimer, this is intended to be educational. It isn't legal advice, so please don't make any decisions or take any actions or inactions based solely on the content we're providing you. You should, as always, engage with an attorney. So today there are a few topic areas. We'll cover the first, of course, HR audits, HR audit best practices. We'll talk a little bit about the new year HR strategy review. What do you do in the beginning of the year as you're reassessing your initiatives for the upcoming year, and how do they align with that, with the objectives of your organization as well? And then we'll go through some Q&A too. So first, move on to audits. And of course, I have to pass it off to Gia, the queen of audits, to talk a little bit about what they are and why they're important.
So really excited to talk about it. I think that the majority of us, when we hear the word audit, we automatically think of like the IRS, right? Something bad is about to happen. And so when we are thinking about audits and the HR standpoint, for example, we want to look at it more of a scenario where in a private space, where we can confidentially look at the status and the structure of our own human resources departments and find out where there are weaknesses and where we have strengths. Of course, when we see that there are areas that need to be resolved, inside of that, we can make a remediation plan. What do we need to fix? How long is it going to take to fix it? How many people do I need to include in the fix of this thing? And then put it on a plan and a calendar so that you can make sure you're giving it the attention and the focus that it needs. And so that's what an audit is. It's just a really good look at where you stand. And I got to tell you, the hardest part probably about audits is it's very difficult to determine what you're supposed to be responsible for. When I think back about my HR career since 98, knowing the type of company, the type of industry, how many employees that I have, all of those things are considerations for what type of audits that you need to have. So we're going to talk about some HR audits that you need to consider inside of this space as you're developing the framework of looking at and really reviewing your department, all the nooks and crannies, and opening up the closet and letting the bones fall out. And so we're going to talk specifically today about payroll and benefits compliance. We're going to talk about compensation, employee and worker classification, which is a huge hot button right now, record retention, and then we're going to also talk about a handbook refresh. I want to note before we move on to the next, though, is that in a comprehensive HR audit, you are looking at not only the things that the federal government, your state governments and municipalities require you to do, but also how you do it. And so that's something we're going to talk about today. The how is almost important sometimes as the what. So that's my little tidbit about audits.
All right, thank you. So first up, payroll, oh my gosh, payroll and benefits compliance. I'll pass it off, Katie, to you, and Amber, to you as well. I know you both had thoughts on this.
Sure. So on the notices and record keeping side, I mean, kind of just to go back to what Gia was talking about, unfortunately, you could probably spend almost your entire year or a big chunk of your year organizing and leading audits, you know, based on all the things that your people team, your HR team has to organize and just be responsible for. Prioritizing notices and record keeping, though, are incredibly important, particularly if your organization has gone through a substantial growth phase, including a merger acquisition. If there's been a big transition from maybe a paper to digital record keeping source, also expanding business operations and moving states. Moving locations too, so going from one location to another as far as like your HQ. If you've updated your handbook, making sure that you're also updating your notices and your record keeping in order to ensure that you're doing what you say and saying what you do, similar to and how you do it, to kind of go back to what Gia was talking about. And then also, if you've expanded your operations, your business operations internationally, it's also really good to engage with counsel, ideally boots on the ground, to understand what you need to provide notices to your employees about on that international side. This is not an inclusive list by any means. It's not an exhaustive list, but it should be a really good starting point for you all with regard to evaluating your notices that you have on hand, and then also how you're keeping records.
All right, and I'm going to dive into workers' compensation. So most states do require workers' compensation. You know, the businesses have to carry it for the employees. I always suggest to any business owners or leaders that they have a workers' compensation policy in their handbook. And just letting the employees know, especially upon orientation, letting them know that it's there, what the reporting procedures are for workers' compensation, because that is really there to make sure that if they do get hurt at work, that they are reporting it, they know who to report it to, they know what to do, and just making sure that the person who is responsible for reporting the employee injury, that they follow through, they follow up with that insurance provider, following all the procedures to a T, making sure everything's good. And then as far as record keeping for the workers' comp, just really maintaining accurate records for the employee injuries, workers' comp claims, and any payments to ensure that all the compliance is there with all the state and federal regulations for that. And the last thing for that piece is going to be, you know, workers' comp can last a very long time because an injury could, you know, flare up again 10 years later, 20 years later, whatever it is. So it's very important to have those records immaculate. So that way, if anyone else is stepping in, they can immediately go in, read what's going on and how to handle that. And then as far as unemployment, so unemployment benefits are primarily funded by the employers. Again, having a statement or policy in their handbook is really important. Just letting them know that it is there. Some states do require employers to withhold a small amount of unemployment tax from the employee's wages. Again, letting them know that they're going to see that in their pay stubs. And then also maintaining accurate records, because we all know like documentation is extremely important. So especially in unemployment cases, just making sure that all the documentation for performance, evaluations, anything about the employee is going to be in their file. So that way, you know, if an unemployment claim is filed, it's all right there. You don't have to go searching. You don't have to go finding anything there. It's going to be right in that file. Someone can pull it out and take care of it right then and there.
I want to add something quickly before I go into ACA compliance on the unemployment. I think that one of the things that I always talk to HR professionals about is, and also organizations and business owners, is the importance of making sure that HR has the final say on all terminations and movements inside of the organization to ensure that there's consistency throughout. So for example, on the unemployment portion, for example, making sure that the reason that the person has been released is consistent across the board. And if it's called one thing when someone did it, to make sure that it's called the same thing if someone else does it. So I wanted to regarding ACA compliance, ACA is probably one of the biggest sources of heartburn probably right now in the HR world, specifically with companies that are considered to be applicable large employers. And the reason I believe is that there's not a ton of information except for the IRS website. One of the things that to consider when you're looking at ACA is one, of course, making sure that you are aware of deadlines. I pulled the recent deadlines. So for the 2023 tax year, the 1095Cs are due to the employees by March the 1st of 2024. The 1094C and the 1095C are due to the IRS if filing by paper by the February the 28th. They're due to the IRS of filing electronically by April the 1st. And it's because, of course, if you're filing it by paper, it's going to take a little bit longer to get there. And then the late filing deadline for the 1094C and 1095C is August the 1st of 2024. I want to quickly notice that for ACA, there are late filing deadlines as well. Late filing fees and penalties that occur if those things are not in. But inside of your ACA reporting as well as ACA auditing, the things that we always look for there is who's responsible. I think a lot of times when there is a violation or there's something that slips through the cracks, is everybody assumes someone else is going to do it. Although it is part HR function, part possibly CPA or CFO function, oftentimes people aren't really supposed to be doing what. So inside of that audit, it's who's responsible for exactly what steps and at what point in the process they're supposed to get involved. So the calculations of the hours and making sure that you're keeping your eye on the wages, making sure that you're being consistent about who's coming in and out of your benefits program. Those things need to be kept, and you need to have an eye on those at the very beginning of the plan year all the way through. Additionally, how things will be filed, how things need to be organized, and who you're going to partner with. One of the best practices, specifically inside of ACA, is working with a benefits group or a broker that actually will do the reporting on your behalf. A lot of the HCMs, human capital management companies, the large ones, your Paycors, Paylocity, UKG, ADPs, a lot of them have platforms and programs where for an additional fee, they will take care of all of those filings for you. And I cannot describe how important that is to utilize that relationship, because there's also a little bit on the hook if there's like a huge mistake that's being made. But to work very closely with your accountant, your CPA, your CFO, and your benefits broker to make sure that there's nothing that's fallen between the cracks. And so again, my recommendation regarding auditing those pieces is making sure you're keeping track of the what, the who, and the how, and making sure that you're staying ahead of those deadlines.
Thank you. When I when I initially put medical plan compliance in here, I thought of one thing, but I do think about a couple of things in here that are really important. The first is, of course, doing basic audits, like, are you providing the right summary of benefits to your employees when you're going through open enrollment or when they're first starting with the organization? Is that right paperwork coming to them? And are they getting what they're supposed to be getting? But you also start thinking about other areas as well, like HIPAA compliance and ensuring from a record keeping perspective that you're being compliant and you're auditing yourself on how you're handling that record keeping on medical records. But it could also be audits on your medical plan itself. You could be doing audits on dependent eligibility, for example, or medical claims or disability. So there are a lot of different audits involved, whether it's related to your medical plan itself, to the way that you handle medical documentation, or to the way that you actually provide this information to your employees that you want to be considerate of. Okay, Katie.
All right, so I volunteered to take on this particular area because we actually just did a massive compensation audit on our side. Compensation audits are going to be hugely impactful, not only to make sure that your team is paid equitably across the board, but also from an engagement perspective and then a talent acquisition perspective to ensure that you're also attracting candidates the best that you can. So, I would say that as you're starting to go through the compensation audit, make sure, number one, that you are adhering to the absolute requirements for all posting requirements and the legal side. So this is coming from my perspective. I'm based in Colorado, which has a lot of pretty strict requirements as it relates to pay transparency in our job requirements, and then also posting the jobs internally, and then also promotional opportunities, and then also now who got the job. So understanding here, how that can also ultimately drive engagement within your organization is pretty substantial. If you're one of those organizations too that has folks that are working remotely, and therefore since you have that one person working in a Colorado or in one of these other locations in which there are more transparency requirements, I would definitely encourage you to make a proposal to your leadership team on some kind of posting requirements that just hit everything all at once. So you're not having to do one-off postings just to hit the Colorado requirement or just to hit any other state requirements. And then with that may also affect your overall compensation philosophy. But it could be in a really nice way and a positive way to show that you are committed to that equitability and that transparency within your team. So if you have already hit all those requirements on that legal side, you know that you are posting appropriately within the locations in which you operate and you have business operations. The next phase would be definitely exploring all of your internal job titles, your functions, your departments. And then conversely, what does the market say about all those specific roles? Again, since I just went through this entire thing within my company, one of the things that I realized very quickly was this is a multi-quarter and then also a multi-stakeholder audit. So you definitely can't do this kind of work within a silo. And so you will need to get some additional eyes, and then also some additional feedback from different members of the leadership team, and then also make your hiring managers aware that you're evaluating this, and making sure that your talent acquisition team is aware. As you're having conversations with your leadership team too, recognizing that as you're going through the compensation audit, you may actually end up getting a pretty substantial evaluation of your budget, and where it may be a really good idea for you to make some adjustments based on market, based on function, based on the fact that after going through this evaluation, you do see there's some gender equality that you need to right size. So just recognizing that as you're diving into a compensation audit, it can be an onion that you do peel back over time, but prioritizing that legal side at the forefront, and then diving into comparison to market and onward is really important. And then lastly too, I would say if you have the budget, if you're one of those companies that has a bit more budget for help here, there are consultants out there that are focused on compensation and total rewards, and seek to get some help, especially as we're talking about And we're going to talk about employment classification. If you're kind of starting from scratch there and you need some help to evaluate some of those roles to see if they are eligible for different classification, I think it's good to get that legal advice and also that additional advice there to make those changes.
All right, thanks, Katie. Employee and worker classification audits, my favorite. I find this so interesting because it is an incredibly dynamic landscape at the moment, and there's a lot changing right now, which Gia will talk about in just a little bit. But making sure that consistently and at least once a year, I'd recommend, especially if you're a multi-state employer and you have some dynamic roles, that you're conducting these employee and worker classification audits to ensure that on the employee classification side, you're classifying people properly as exempt or non-exempt, and on the worker side that you're classifying them as an employee versus an independent contractor. Wage theft is the number one issue why employers get sued. Most of that having to do with just missing out on overtime or minimum wage issues or lack of benefits that they would be getting if they were employees otherwise. And it's something that's consistently changing. So there's a new ruling that was released last week that we'll talk about in just a minute regarding independent contractors. And it's something that we definitely want to be keeping a pulse on. So today, what makes it even more interesting is that depending on the state that the employee is working in, their role can be classified differently based on the type of test that's being used. So the federal government and about 25-ish states use what's called the common law test, whereas there are about 25 other states, including California, that use the ABC test. So it does get to be a little difficult. What if, you have to, you're looking at like what the FLSA requires and then what a state requires, and is there one that supersedes the other? It can get quite complicated. So when you're conducting these audits, you'd want to do a couple things. You'd either really want to work with a company that can help you walk through these audits by providing legal guidance, whether it's through a company like Auditocity or even VirgilHR. We have a tool that allows you to do this as well, or even engaging with an attorney and having them do these audits for you. It's really critical. There was a point in time, Katie, you might remember this actually. It was several years ago, Maryland changed their law on how essentially you ended up classifying a sales development representative. Do you remember this, Katie? No. And basically, with the new test, an SDR now became non-exempt, meaning they were qualified for overtime. And a lot of companies just didn't realize it or didn't want to change it. And they ended up getting into a lot of trouble from a wage theft perspective. So even if your role might not change, the law sometimes will. So you want to be very careful about doing these audits consistently and with rigor and making sure that you're partnering with the right support that can help you with it.
So, the interesting thing about the independent contractors ruling is that I think it's been looming for a while. The changes that they've made to it, and we're going to go over those in detail, but the changes that they made to it, a lot of them were common sense. I always share with employers that, the IRS understands exactly why contractors are, attractive in a lot of scenarios. And so the waters have been muddy for a very long time between employees as well as independent contractors. And so as we go through the rule, I think that you'll also find that a lot of the changes that they made and to make it a little bit more stringent, they were really common sense. And I do believe that, the looking at if your people are classified correctly, if they're classified versus employees versus independent contractors, that should happen on a pretty frequent basis. I say that it absolutely needs to happen annually, but it also needs to happen as you have new rules and new roles that you're starting to introduce into the organization and new managers to make sure that you don't have a rogue manager that decides to classify people in a new way. So in the new ruling, it was effective in March of 2024. Effective in March of 2024. And that the guidance looks at who is an employee versus, of course, who's an independent contractor under the Fair Labor Standards Act. And so what it's going to do, it was published in January the 7th, and it replaces it with a 6-factor analysis that looks at the worker's opportunity for profit or loss. So of course, if it's an employee, no matter how the company does, the employee gets the same amount of money unless they're being paid hourly, where they may get more hours or fewer hours. Does the worker have the ability to make more money if the scope expands, or will they lose money if the scope of work has changed outside of just the hours? So that's one of the ways that you can look at, is a person an employee or are they an independent contractor? The next thing is the investments that are made by the worker as well as the employer. Does the employee have to make investments in tools and equipment and the training of a staff, certifications, insurances, licensures, all those things? Does the worker have to make investments in order to be able to work on that project? If they don't, the person could possibly be an employee if the larger company is the only person that's making investments in order for that project to be able to move forward. The next is the degree of permanence of the work relationship. Is that person going to be able to be there forever until something bad happens? Or is it more project-based work? Like, what is the degree of permanence inside of that relationship? Because if it's an independent contractor, when that work is done, possibly the person is moving forward unless the scope has been extended or additional assignments have been given inside of that contract. That should be very specific. The fourth thing is the nature and the degree of the control over the performance of the work. I always say that if you go into an organization and you can't tell the difference between the employee and the independent contractor, you probably are dealing with all employees. And so the independent contractor should have the ability to control their own work, possibly the hours, when they come in, when they leave, what gets done in what order, because if they are just trying to complete the work in order for it to go through inspection of that employer, how they get to it doesn't necessarily have to be under the mandate and strict management of the larger employer or the client in the sake of an independent contractor. So the nature and the degree of the control of that performance is also a key factor for analysis. The fifth one is the extent to which the work performed is an integral part of the employer's business. Is it a core function of that business, or is it something that this person or this independent contracting group can come in just to take care of this section of the business? And then the last piece is the use of the worker's skill and initiative. This is one that is hugely a sticking point, as oftentimes people are brought in as a contractor, but they don't have a very specific skill or initiative that they've done in order to be able to get the job. So it may be a receptionist, or it may be a person that is doing very manual labor. Is that person really an independent contractor, or are they an employee? So instead of using the core factors that are set forth in that 2011 rule, that really looks at it as the totality of circumstances analysis, this is the new 6-factor analysis that is now being used. And I think you will agree that the majority of it is absolutely common sense.
Yep, thank you. All right, record retentions. I think, Gia, you said you'd touch on this a little bit too.
Sure thing. Regarding record retention and looking at audits, one of the things that we always look at when we're taking a look at the record retention is, are we in fact doing what we said we were going to do? There are certain things, and I think that Katie, I think you're going to cover the very specific things regarding record retention. There are some federal guidelines and state guidelines about certain documents. However, one of the ways that employers often get in trouble is by not doing what they said that they were going to do. And so by determining and writing a policy and a procedure about this is what we're going to do inside of these key factors that we have listed here, that is a key point in making sure that your system is doing what your system is supposed to do. It's really easy to look at someone else's policy and to say, yeah, we're going to do that, but it doesn't make sense for your business. Therefore, you need to really adjust it to make sure that it's something that makes sense for the way that you do work. I worked for a company before that used to do manufacturing all the way back from the time of World War I. And their thought of, doing retention of documents and destruction of documents is we're going to move them from HR and move them to a warehouse where they can sit and we have 100 years worth of documents. And so that's not what we mean here. So you need to define record. What is included inside of a record? What are you looking at? Are we looking at auxiliary forms as well? Or is it very specifically this thing that we are including in the term of record? We're going to make sure that you have a retention schedule, and inside of an audit, we want to make sure that you're following your retention schedule, and that's done by taking a look at documents and looking at the date of those documents to see if it's something that should have been removed already. Who has access to the documents, which is so critical, especially in the documents that Katie's going to talk about in just a moment. It should be people who are on a need to know basis only, and you shouldn't be able to have, random people who are just part of the league to be able to access those records and possibly take them out of rotation where you might miss one of your retention standards. The way that you're going to store them and format, how are you going to store them? Are they going to be a lock and key, a room that's under lock and key? And is it going to be electronic versus being a paper version? Your security and privacy, of course. What information would you not want to get out to the larger public to make sure that those documents are kept very private? How you're going to destroy them? If you're going to destroy them, exactly what way is it going to happen? Are they going to be shredded? Are they going to be taken to a facility? And that needs to be talked about inside of your procedure. So that's something that can be audited. And it's very easy to find out if you're adhering to that or not. And then lastly, consistent policy implementation and having those periodic audits to make sure that in fact, you're doing those things that you've stated that you're going to do, which is probably the most critical area inside of record retention.
So on the hiring records retention, so I'm going to cover the first 3 bullet points on this. But to go back to what Gia was talking about on the policy side, coming up and working closely with a legal team, whether that's internal or external, to come up with your policy on record retention is hugely important here, because it really depends on. It could depend on your backer. It could depend on, if you're a public company versus not. Like, what are the things that are going to drive some of your record retention policies ultimately? And if you need to retain some of those records a little bit longer, then maybe someone else or another company. And so it would be really important to work with the legal team on that. The other teams that you should probably get input from as you're developing that policy include your IT team, because coming back to like, these are digital, where are they going to be stored? And coming back to how are these going to be destroyed once they're finished, and we're ready to move on from that. Another team that may be on the need to know, but also you may require to have input on this includes your accounting team, maybe because they're running the payroll or they need to also do that AP/AR on some of the medical record side. So I just want to come back, like the really looking at developing a policy is going to save you so much time, and because you have something to point out very quickly. As far as, okay, I'm ready to, purge this file versus we have to save this file for this long. SHRM does have a really helpful list of a starting point that you can start to use and develop from there. And so that's actually what I used when I developed my first retention policy a few years ago in cooperation with a legal team. So I would highly recommend, if you don't have any policy right now, let's start with SHRM if you don't know where else to start, and check out what they recommend, because it is based on some of those federal guidelines. When we're looking at the hiring record retention here too, really kind of think about, like, what are all the things that we need to go back to? Maybe like, I always joke, like the Jocelyn of 2025, or like the Amber or the Gia of 2026. They want to look back and say, like, wow, the past me was so smart to have that forethought to like save this information, right? And so what are all the things on that hiring side that got you to the decision to hire this person? And so really thinking about, you know, their overall application, their resume, the advertisement that we use to confirm that we held up our end of the deal and met those legal requirements on the posting, right? Also, if you're using any tests, if you're using any assessments, include those, because those are some things to make sure that you have eliminated bias, especially if there were multiple candidates within that that particular role. So anything that you can think of within the hiring decision that really helped for you to make that decision. Also check with your ATS and see what their data retention policy is. So you can see, do I need to download all this information and save it, you know, on the cloud in my own system, or what are the system and what's their backup, right? So what are they saving on the ATS side? And then what is their backup? Should everything, you know, fall apart on their side? Like, what can we make sure that we have access to? And if we should download copies of it. Then on the maintenance of employee files, you know, this is where we're actually in the midst of doing a personnel file audit right now, because we have gone through some pretty substantial growth, including an acquisition of another organization. And so again, it comes back to what are the decisions we can trace back to getting this person within the organization. So the hiring decision, and then also what's all the documentation that we have here to ensure that we're paying them correctly. And that can be, you know, whether we're paying them correctly if they're on leave, or paying them correctly because they got a promotion or a merit increase. So anything that has to do with compensation and payroll, make sure that that is all captured within your employee file as well. Transfers, any incentive plans, also employment authorization. That's a confirmation too that they're eligible to work and so therefore can be paid. So that's kind of like how I think about it. It's how do we get them in the door? And then how are we making sure that we're adhering to what we need to get them paid and paid appropriately, including when they're going on leave. So medical leave, military leave, all of those pieces. And then lastly, on that electronic record keeping, you know, like I said, like going back to what Gia talked about, really work with your IT team, work with other stakeholders to understand what is captured within your electronic record system, and cross-check that with your retention policy. You can also check in with your HRIS and what is their retention policy. Some folks will save all their personnel files within their HRIS. Other times you got to do a double dip and do, you know, save it here and save it here. And so just confirming what systems you have to make your job easier. Are they ultimately going to make your job harder if for some reason something happens to that particular piece of technology? And then lastly, and this is something that sounds a little elementary, and probably a lot of you all are doing this already, naming conventions have saved my life so many times. And I'm so grateful to all of my colleagues who are very insistent on using naming conventions. It is the smallest thing to do, but it will save so much time when you're especially looking for that you know, most recent JD, most recent transfer, or you know, merit increase. Like, just use a naming convention, put it in place. It'll make your life so much easier.
I couldn't agree more with that. It saved me many times. So talking about access to personnel files, you know, an audit could really happen at any time. We don't know what could happen. The audits I've seen typically have been a really upset employee who has just opened a can of worms and just, you know, done everything they can to destroy the business, whatever you'd call it. But that's really where I've seen audits come in recently. And I would say, just with the access part, I've had auditors come in and ask, you know, who has access to this, whether it's paper files or digital files, who has access to it? They want a list. They want, you know, everybody's, you know, when they've last accessed it, if it's digital, if it's paper, is it locked? Making sure that it's in an area that's, you know, pretty confidential, or somewhere that it's in a locked filing cabinet that not many people have access to. They want to make sure that only the key stakeholders or the need to knows have access to those files. And whenever an auditor comes in, just really making sure that you have all the relevant records in their personnel file. especially, either if it's digital or paper, whatever you're doing, but making sure that it's consistent. So every file is going to look a little different, but just making sure it's consistent, that you have the same type of paperwork you would have in one as you would in another. And organization helps quite a bit, whether you're doing paper or digital as well. You never want to fail at complying with record retention requirements, because it can result in fines, penalties, and even legal action. Also, I've seen employers get in trouble with not having a secure location for the personnel files, where it's in an open area. Any employee can walk in, get access to it. And like Gia said earlier, I worked with a company that whenever they had old files, it was a 105-year-old company, and when they had old files, they just stuck it in the basement, and spider webs and cobwebs and all that kind of stuff was down there. I was like, that's fantastic. So just making sure that you are retaining those and destroying them, which we'll talk about in a second, but keep it consistent, keep the files consistent, whether it's digital or paper. And then going into the security of employment records, you want to have something implemented where there are certain security measures to protect sensitive employee information. Think about yourself. If you have your social security number, your birthday, your address, all of that personal information, your direct deposit information in a file that is readily accessed to, anyone could walk in and find it. Think about that. Like, would you want somebody to just walk in and get your personal information? No, absolutely not, because identity theft is absolutely awful to deal with. So just having something implemented where, you are taking those extra precautions. If it's paper files, making sure that it is secure and it's locked and only the certain amount of people have access to it. If it's digital, talking to your IT or whoever you're talking with to make sure that you have a very secure location digitally. And don't have both. You really need to make sure that if you're going to have digital records, it all needs to be digital. If you're going to have paper records, it all needs to be paper. So keep it consistent with that as well. It makes it a lot easier, especially with security. Record retention, there are, the best practice is 7 years. However, there are some states, and you'll have to check your state, but there are some states that do require you to have your records kept a lot longer than the 7 years. Or, I've actually been told with some of the workers' comp claims that an insurance broker once told me, and I'm not sure if it's true, but she said, keep it 30 years. I'm like, wow, that's a lot. And she goes, you'll thank me later, because like I said, in the workers' comp part, you could have a claim that opens up years later for the exact same reason. That would be helpful when it's a digital file, but typically we'll go, the best practice is 7 years. And when you're, getting rid of those records and disposing of them, just making sure it is consistent, it's secure, and it's safe. Yeah, so stick to your 7 years, but double check with your states too.
Thank you, Amber. And just to add, because I think consistency is a topic today. Consistency is really key. Somebody recently asked me about doing an audit on I-9 files, and I'd never done one before myself, so I didn't know this, but it made me think of it when you were talking about keeping digital copies versus paper copies. With an I-9 audit, it has to be one or the other. It can't be, you have some that are digital and some that are paper. So I actually wasn't aware of that. So for anyone on the call who has a bit of both, you should definitely take a look at that, because it needs to be one or the other. Okay, handbook refresh. It's of course, we all talk about every year at least doing a once-year review with our HR team, with our managers, with our attorneys on a handbook to ensure that you're up to date with all federal, state, and local employment and labor laws. They're consistently changing, as everybody knows. We have about 400 to 500 new laws passed every year across the US, and it makes it really difficult for us to keep track of our handbook. I will shamelessly insert here by saying that VirgilHR has a very cool employee handbook builder that actually updates all of your policies real time into your handbook, so that as laws change, you'll automatically get that new policy populated into your handbook and then notified, so you can redistribute to your team. You don't have to sit down and do that once a year review with a lawyer and kind of have an outdated handbook the rest of the year. But I will say that it's really important that even with a tool like that, you're still doing a refresh from a culture perspective. They're still ensuring you have all the legal requirements that you have to have in there, and that you're also on the same page with your management team as well. This isn't just, everybody thinks that a handbook refresh is just an HR process, and it's not. The management team really needs to be involved and bought into the policies that you put in place. We need to ensure that they understand what the procedures are to doing anything from a promotion to a demotion to a termination to what happens when somebody asks for leave. So it's really key that everybody's on the same page. So different areas that you should particularly consider when you're looking at a handbook refresh is going to be anything related to minimum wage. We've had, gosh, I want to say at least 10, 15 states this year alone pass new minimum wage laws. California on its own has 42 different minimum wage laws across the state, cities, and counties. It's a very complicated topic area, and you want to make sure that your handbook is up to date there. Anything related to leave laws, there are a lot of states that have updated their leave laws as well, and we do have some proposals that are going on right now related to different changes in the FMLA, which could significantly impact your employee handbook. So you'd want to be aware of that. Any benefits changes, obviously, that would occur when you're not actually when you're doing the handbook refresh, but actually when the benefits are changing. You'd want to do that audit as part of your kind of benefits onboarding. And then overtime and meal and rest break rules. Those will change periodically as well, all across the US. And you want to make sure that if you have an employee in Arizona, they have the right information about what their overtime and meal rest break policies are compared to that of California. A lot of people will ask, should I just give one handbook that has everything with all of the state policies, in addition to kind of those more general or corporate policies? And I would recommend no, that you have one corporate handbook and then you provide a state addendum for each employee based on where they're working. Could be a couple different states if they travel for work, but that way you don't have somebody in Rhode Island upset that somebody in California has X amount of sick time, because that's what you're legally required to give them, and you're not giving everybody the maximum. Ensure that you're providing separate handbooks to employees and contractors. They should be totally different handbooks. And note that you're held liable civilly to the content of your handbooks. So you should really follow your own processes and policies, which is why, again, getting managers on board is so critical. Make sure, of course, you have an attorney review the handbook beforehand. And just remember to please incorporate FLSA language into your handbook to ensure that everybody is aware that nothing in the handbook is meant to in any way take away their rights under the FLSA. There are some lawsuits that have gone on as a result of that. And so that's some language that you should really plug in and talk to a lawyer about. Okay, so the HR strategy review, there are a lot of pieces to your HR strategy, of course, and we want to make sure that as we are getting ready for the year and we're doing our spring cleaning come January for the rest of 2024, that we're considering certain pieces of it and how they actually impact the rest of the organization. And that can run from recruitment and hiring, it can include succession planning, employee comms, DE&I. I thought it would be really great in this section to actually have our panelists just give a couple anecdotal stories of experiences that they've had as they've been working on their HR strategy review with their team, with their executive team, and what type of wisdom they would impart on those here in the webinar today.
I can jump in on that one because I have the perfect example that happened today. It's kind of touching on recruitment and hiring, onboarding, and then position descriptions. So, I have a client who gave a job description, hired a person under that job description, and it's completely changed. It is not the same job description. It's kind of an all over type of position right now. And the employee's really frustrated. She's upset. She's like, I don't even know what's in my scope of work. I don't know if I'm overstepping. Where's my boundaries? Where's my line at? And I'm seeing this a lot that, jobs over time change. And it's a really good time at the beginning of the year to reevaluate what the positions are, especially if you're a smaller business. defining what those positions are. If they've changed, update those position descriptions. If you're recruiting for positions in that, just update those, making sure that those people that you're bringing on are going to stay. You're going to retain them because they know what they're doing. So beginning of the year is always a good idea, and just having them sign off on any new job descriptions too. I always think that's very helpful because there's a clear definition of I know what I'm doing, and the employer is also like I know what they're doing. So those are just recent events that I've seen. It retains your best talent when you have those in place.
I have a couple of things that really stand out to me. And Amber, that was a fantastic anecdote there. One is that when I'm looking at the HR strategy, the beginning of a year is a fantastic time for each of us to really give ourselves a quick training and the new things that have happened over the course of the year and the things that are going to be instituted for the year that we're in. Because there are things like the pay transparency and posting, for example, that I think there are 8 states that had already adopted it. There were, I think, about 15 states that were going to adopt it. And it's varying rules inside of each of those. I think Colorado, Katie, where you are, is like the gold standard for like that particular thing right now. But it says that you have to put, some of them say that you have to put the amount that you're going to pay the individual on the job posting themselves. You have to disclose. In some other states, if someone asks what's the range, you have to give it to them. You have to give them the true factors. You've got to tell them about the bonuses that are going to possibly be getting on the side of those jobs. And you also have to give the different conditions in which it could impact the pay, whether it be certifications or education or things of that nature. Another thing that really stands out to me from this list is, and it kind of tips on what Jocelyn talked about a little bit earlier, ensuring that your policies and even employment agreements are not stepping on employees' rights, even inside of the NLRA. So, for example, employees have the right to talk about their pay and their benefits and their working conditions. That's a federally protected law. And so, I've seen in my consulting practice, as late as a couple of weeks ago, where an employer said that, no, you as part of your compensation package cannot speak about your pay or your benefits. We're going to give you way more PTO than everybody else. We're going to pay you this amount of money. We're going to give you this bonus, and you can't talk about it. And we had to go back and tell them, you cannot prevent them from talking about it. It's protected concerted activity. And then the other part is regarding performance reviews and performance management, making sure that HR is at the forefront and having really good, having great relationships with the management team. But executive leadership needs to really solidify to the rest of management that human resources must check off on, write-ups and disciplinary actions, terminations, to make sure that different things are being treated consistently across the enterprise. And that this group isn't being written up because they missed 2 days, where the sales group can miss 23 days and nothing is being done to them. So I think that having those consistencies across the board, we are, as HR professionals, we're generally the gatekeepers there. And so I would recommend having good conversations with executive management for them to understand that human resources is a help. And we have to have a seat at the table. And our goal is to make sure that we're reducing and mitigating risk for the organization, and that we are going to show our value if they trust us enough to tell us what's going on, so that we can make sure that there's consistency across the board. Katie?
Yeah, so that's where actually I wanted to kind of jump in, because when I looked at this list for the first time, part of what I thought about was like, but I've been in a position, and it's entirely possible that folks on this call presenting right now have actually been in the position, but how do I get people to even listen to me about these particular areas, right? And so just to kind of, like emphasize a lot of what Gia just started talking about, what I wanted to touch on is how do you start to get that seat at the table and work toward that? I think one thing to think about, which has made a big impact for me, is it is a long game for you. And so if you're in a position where you're at an organization where you love the organization, you love overall the culture, the people, the mission, everything that you're doing within the organization seems to be true to what you want to impact. But there's opportunity for you to really move from that maybe more transactional into that people business partner and that strategic partnership. But you're not seeing how to do it yet. Or there's not even really that, like maybe senior executive leadership doesn't know what to do with you, if you're even in that position. What I would highly recommend doing is start with your executive leadership team. Start to have bi-weekly, maybe even monthly one-on-ones, just to start to get a pulse of the organization and see where there are opportunities for you to find, maybe there are inconsistencies being applied, and you can say, well, that really puts us at risk. It's a liability if we treat other people differently. So this is where I can help. Seek opportunities for you to be that problem solver, and share the reasons why it's really important for you to take that step and then help to solve the problem. And then maybe ideally they don't make the same mistake over and over, right? But start with your executive leadership team, start with your managers, and really start meeting with them, come up with a plan, and then deliver on that plan, execute, and then do it again, and do it again, and do it again. So again, like this is a long game strategy, but when you break it down into bite-sized pieces, ideally, once you get to your own assessment within, your first year or so, or first 6 months, your top executives, your C-suite, they're going to look back and be like, oh my gosh, look at all the things that our people team pushed forward. Look at all the things our HR team pushed forward, and all, the preventative work that they did for us. And so just saying, like, those are just some pieces that I feel like were really big lessons that I learned over the course of the last few years. And I hope for anyone out there that's kind of, in that position too, just know that it's totally possible to keep moving that needle up and to become that strategic partner.
Yep. Thank you, Katie. We've definitely had our adventures together, working on a people team together. So I totally hear you, and I can see how a lot of those things that you have done have really impacted your success as an HR leader. I would say just super high level for an HR strategy review, when you're really sitting down and doing it, be sure to take a look at the key objectives that your business has set for the year. Typically they'll have between 3 and 5, and determine, is everything that you're doing somehow impacting each of those core objectives? Because we want to be, of course, as aligned to the business as possible. But to Katie's point, we also want to ensure that we are appropriately supporting the other executives at the company with their own initiatives, because when we're supporting them, then they support our own kind of initiatives as well. And we're able to work together to really kind of align and get the company going in the direction that we want to head in. So for example, if there's a goal of achieving 30 million in ARR by the end of the year, then you sit down with your sales leader and you say, hey, what's the quota for each account executive that you have? How many SDRs do you need to support X number of leads coming through? Like, what's the conversion rates for them? Like, what does this volume look like? And then from there, we need to really talk about, what does your sales plan look like? What does your commission structure look like? Are we appropriately compensating them? There's so much work that goes into it just to support a sales team. How does onboarding work for your team today? And is it effective? And have we audited really the success of this onboarding program that we put in place for your sales team, and so on and so on. So you really want to take a look at those metrics, the initiatives that you have in place, auditing those initiatives, determining whether or not they support the overall kind of key objectives of the business, and then move from there. And then lastly, before Q&A, how to easily conduct an audit, we just say, leverage informational resources from organizations like SHRM, check out VirgilHR, please check out Auditocity, join the Elite HR Connections, free membership to start, to collaborate with other HR leaders. Thank you all so much for your time.
Thank you.
Bye, thank you.
Bye, thank you.
Bye.